There exists within Jungian psychology a concept so profound, so extraordinarily rare, that most practitioners spend entire careers without ever witnessing it firsthand in a patient. It is called Sophia, derived directly from the ancient Greek word for wisdom, and it represents something that Carl Jung himself described with a mixture of reverence and unmistakable caution. Sophia is not simply intelligence. It is not accumulated knowledge or even hard-won experience. It is the final destination of what Jung called the individuation process, specifically the complete integration of the anima, that deep feminine psychological force residing within every human psyche regardless of biological sex. When a person reaches Sophia-level integration, something genuinely remarkable happens. The boundaries between conscious and unconscious thought begin dissolving in productive ways. Perception deepens. Patterns become visible that remain completely invisible to ordinary consciousness. Relationships, symbols, and meaning itself take on extraordinary dimensionality. Jung believed this represented psychological wholeness at its most complete expression, a state where wisdom stops being something you pursue and becomes something you simply embody. But here is where things become genuinely dangerous, and why Jung's warnings deserve serious attention rather than casual dismissal. The highest stage of psychological development carries within it a dark twin shadow, a paradox that can transform liberation into a sophisticated and nearly invisible trap. The very perception that makes Sophia-level consciousness so powerful can simultaneously disconnect a person from ordinary human reality in ways that feel indistinguishable from enlightenment itself. What we are going to explore together is both sides of this extraordinary coin, the remarkable gift that genuine Sophia-level perception offers, and Jung's specific, urgent warnings about psychological inflation and the profound isolation that can quietly consume those who mishandle this most powerful of psychological thresholds. To understand Sophia-level integration, you first need to understand the psychological architecture that Carl Jung spent his lifetime mapping with extraordinary precision and dedication. Jung proposed that beneath the conscious mind, beneath even the personal unconscious where your individual memories and repressions reside, there exists something far older and far more powerful. He called this the collective unconscious, and buried within it are what he termed archetypes. Archetypes are not ideas you learned or beliefs you developed through personal experience. They are ancient symbolic patterns, inherited psychological structures that humanity has carried across thousands of generations. They shape your dreams without your permission. They fuel your deepest fears and your most irrational attractions. They surface in mythology, religion, and storytelling across every culture precisely because they originate from something universally human rather than individually personal. The shadow, the hero, the wise old man, the great mother, these are all archetypal figures that influence behavior in ways most people never consciously recognize. Among the most significant archetypes Jung identified are the anima and the animus. The anima is the feminine soul image residing within a man's psyche, while the animus is the masculine soul image residing within a woman's psyche. This distinction matters enormously. These are not statements about gender identity or literal personality traits. They are psychological forces, inner figures that carry qualities the conscious personality has not yet fully claimed or integrated. Jung's individuation process describes the lifelong journey of recognizing these unconscious projections, withdrawing them from the external world where we mistakenly place them onto other people, and integrating them consciously into a unified self. This process is not comfortable. It is not quick, but Jung believed it represented the only genuine path toward authentic psychological wholeness and true self-awareness. Jung did not describe anima integration as a single dramatic event. He mapped it as a four-stage developmental journey, each stage representing a progressively deeper and more conscious relationship with the inner feminine. Understanding these stages is essential because they reveal exactly how extraordinary and exactly how treacherous the final destination truly is. The first stage Jung called Eve. At this most primitive level, a man's anima remains almost entirely unconscious and projected outward onto actual women in his life. His perception is fundamentally binary and distorted. Women appear to him as either purely nurturing and life-giving or threatening and destructive. There is no genuine perception of women as complete, complex human beings. The man is essentially seeing his own unconscious reflected back at him, mistaking that reflection for reality itself. The second stage is Helen, named after Helen of Troy. Here, the projection becomes idealized romantic obsession. The inner feminine is experienced through the lens of beauty, desire, and inspiration. This stage drives enormous creative energy, but remains fundamentally a projection, an image rather than genuine integration. The third stage Jung called Mary, drawing on the sacred feminine archetype. Something genuinely significant shifts here. Spirituality emerges within the relationship to the inner feminine. The anima begins carrying qualities of transcendence, meaning, and sacred depth. The man begins sensing that this inner figure points towards something beyond ordinary personal psychology. Then comes Sophia. At this fourth and final stage, the inner feminine is no longer experienced as a separate figure being projected outward or even encountered inwardly as something distinct from the self. She becomes fully integrated into conscious selfhood. Perception itself transforms. Thinking becomes direct, undistorted by unconscious projection, and naturally aligned with deep archetypal intelligence that operates beneath ordinary rational thought. Something important needs clarifying here, because a significant amount of Jungian content online treats the anima integration model as though it applies universally to everyone regardless of sex. Jung was more precise than that, and that precision matters enormously when we are discussing something as consequential as Sophia-level development. For women, Jung described the parallel journey as animus integration, and while the destination is identical, the symbolic landscape looks meaningfully different across four distinct stages. The first stage of animus development centers on physical power. The animus appears in a woman's psychology primarily as raw masculine force, strength, and vitality, often projected onto physically powerful men in her external world. The second stage introduces romantic initiative. The animus now carries qualities of action, pursuit, and romantic agency. Think of the romantic hero archetype, the figure who acts decisively and sweeps toward meaningful connection. Again, this remains largely projection rather than genuine integration. The third stage Jung associated with the word, or logos, representing intellect, rational discourse, and the capacity for independent thought. A woman at this stage begins experiencing the animus as an inner voice of intellectual authority and discernment, rather than an external figure to be found in the world. The fourth stage is the mediator, the direct parallel to Sophia. Here, the animus becomes a living bridge between conscious identity and the deepest layers of archetypal intelligence within the unconscious. Perception becomes clear, direct, and undistorted. The symbols differ. The destination does not. Jung's broader point applies equally to both men and women with absolute consistency. The entire individuation process, regardless of which inner figure you are integrating, ultimately serves one fundamental purpose. It stops unconscious projections from continuously distorting your perception of other people and of reality itself. Picture someone who has spent years, perhaps decades, doing the kind of inner work most people never attempt. Thousands of pages of journals filled with honest self-examination, hundreds of dreams carefully recorded and analyzed for symbolic meaning. Shadow work that required confronting genuinely uncomfortable truths about their own psychology, sustained therapeutic relationships that pushed past surface-level insight into something far more structurally transformative. What does life actually feel like for this person once genuine Sophia-level integration occurs? Jung described the quality of consciousness at this stage using his concept of psychological differentiation. In most people, the four primary psychological functions, intuition, feeling, thinking, and sensation, remain tangled together in an unconscious muddle. Emotions contaminate thinking, unexamined assumptions distort intuition, sensation gets filtered through layers of projection before it ever reaches conscious awareness. At the Sophia stage, these functions become genuinely separated and independently accessible. The person can think clearly without emotion, hijacking the process, and feel deeply without losing rational perspective. They can trust intuitive impressions precisely because those impressions are no longer contaminated by unconscious wishful thinking or unresolved fear. The practical perceptual results are remarkable and sometimes unsettling to witness. This person walks into a room and senses almost immediately when someone's projected confidence is actually performing over a foundation of deep insecurity. They hear the shame living underneath another person's anger before that person has any conscious awareness of it themselves. They notice relational patterns unfolding between people in real time, seeing 3 moves ahead in interpersonal dynamics while everyone else is still responding to what just happened on the surface. This is not mysticism. This is what becomes possible when decades of genuine inner work finally clear the perceptual lens that unconscious projection had been distorting all along. The gifts of Sophia-level perception are real and extraordinary, but Jung was unambiguous about something equally real that accompanies those gifts, and it deserves honest examination rather than romantic idealization. Perceptual clarity at this level becomes exhausting in ways that are genuinely difficult to communicate to someone who has not experienced it. When you can sense the emotional dynamics operating beneath a conversation's surface, every social interaction carries additional weight. You are not simply hearing what people say, you are simultaneously registering what they cannot say, what they are defending against, what old wound is quietly driving their current behavior. This happens automatically, without effort and without an off switch. Surface-level conversation becomes increasingly difficult to sustain, not because the person has become arrogant or dismissive of ordinary human exchange, but because the gap between what is being said and what is actually happening becomes impossible to ignore. Sitting through small talk while watching 3 layers of unconscious relational scripting play out simultaneously is not comfortable. It is isolating in a way that cuts surprisingly deep. The social experience Jung's most integrated patients described carries a particular quality of grief. You are perpetually unseen while seeing everything around you. People misread your silence as judgment. Your perceptiveness gets experienced as intimidating or strange. You become a stranger in rooms full of people who would genuinely like to connect with you, but cannot quite reach where you actually are. Jung framed this experience explicitly through his concept of the individual's struggle against the collective, against what he called the mass man, the psychologically unconscious majority whose social world operates on shared assumptions and unexamined projections. This isolation is not personal failure. It is not arrogance. Jung recognized it as a predictable and genuinely painful consequence of genuine psychological development. Of all the dangers Jung identified at the Sophia stage, psychological inflation is the most insidious, precisely because it arrives wearing the face of genuine wisdom. It does not announce itself as corruption. It feels from the inside, like clarity deepening further. Inflation begins with a subtle but catastrophic shift in identity. The person moves from experiencing themselves as someone who has earned access to genuine wisdom through years of difficult inner work to experiencing themselves as wisdom itself. That single degree of movement changes everything. What was a perceptual gift becomes a weapon of superiority. What was genuine insight becomes a tool for establishing hierarchy and control over others. Jung borrowed the concept of the monopersonality from anthropological research into indigenous cultures. Mana described a kind of supernatural power or authority that certain objects, places, or people were believed to carry. Jung used this term to describe what happens when the ego becomes intoxicated by its encounter with archetypal intelligence and begins believing it personally embodies that authority rather than simply having access to it. The inflated person stops experiencing wisdom as something moving through them and starts experiencing it as something they fundamentally are. The behavioral signs are specific and recognizable once you know what to look for. Genuine listening stops. Conversations transform into opportunities for delivering verdicts rather than genuine exchanges between equals. The inflated person's perception becomes, in their own experience, the only correct and final perspective available. Other viewpoints are not engaged with seriously, but are instead evaluated against the inflated person's conclusions and found lacking. What makes this particularly dangerous is that the inflated person's perceptions are often genuinely accurate. The corruption is not in the perception itself, but in what the ego does with it afterward. Consider a composite portrait drawn from the patterns Jung and later Jungian analysts observed repeatedly. A man in his mid-40s who has done genuine, serious psychological work. years of quality therapy, deep engagement with shadow material, real transformation that people in his life noticed and respected. He earned his insight honestly through sustained effort and genuine courage, but something has shifted in how that insight operates within his closest relationships. His partner comes to him upset about a conflict with a colleague. She wants to feel heard. She wants connection and presence. What she receives instead is analysis. He listens for approximately 90 seconds before beginning to map her emotional response onto psychological frameworks, identifying her attachment patterns, naming the childhood wound he believes is being activated, explaining what is really happening beneath what she thinks is happening. He is completely sincere. This is the detail that makes the dynamic so difficult to identify and so painful to experience from the receiving end. He genuinely believes he is offering her something valuable. He believes his perception of her inner landscape is a gift he is generously sharing. The possibility that she might simply need to be met rather than mapped does not register as a real option. His loved ones begin describing a particular feeling in his presence. They feel examined rather than seen, categorized rather than loved. The relationship has quietly transformed from a genuine meeting between two people into something resembling a therapeutic assessment where only one person holds the credentials and the other is perpetually the subject of study. Empathy has become analysis, connection has become diagnosis, and because his psychological perceptions are frequently accurate, the people around him struggle to articulate why something feels so fundamentally wrong. A question worth sitting with carefully is where this extraordinary perceptual sensitivity actually originates, because the answer shapes everything about how safely it can be developed and expressed. Modern trauma-informed psychology offers one compelling explanation: hypervigilance, the capacity to read emotional atmospheres with unusual precision, to detect threat signals before they become explicit, to track the invisible emotional weather in a room, frequently develops as a survival response in early environments where safety was unpredictable. The nervous system learns to scan constantly because missing a signal once carried real consequences. What begins as a protective adaptation can, over decades of development and inner work, refine itself into something that resembles genuine wisdom. Jung would not have dismissed this explanation, but he would have insisted it was incomplete. His teleological framework understood the psyche as moving purposefully toward individuation regardless of how that movement was initiated. The origin of a gift does not determine its destination. What matters is whether the person consciously integrates the full story of how they came to perceive the way they do. Jung also identified what he called the introverted intuitive psychological type, individuals who arrive in the world with an innate and unusual sensitivity to the invisible dynamics operating beneath the surface of social and relational life. For these people, deep perception is not primarily a learned survival skill. It is closer to a native language. But here is where shadow work becomes absolutely non-negotiable at the Sophia stage. Whether your perceptual gifts began as survival adaptations or innate type characteristics, if you have not done serious shadow work around their origins, around the fear, the need for control, the hunger for safety that may still be quietly driving them, then the wisdom growing from those gifts will ultimately serve the wrong master entirely. Jung's answer to both inflation and isolation was not to retreat from the perceptual gifts that Sophia-level integration brings. It was something far more demanding than retreat. He called it conscious participation, and it requires the ego to do something that feels profoundly counterintuitive at this stage of development. Conscious participation is a complete reversal of the inflated ego's preferred position. The inflated ego observes from above, perceives from a safe analytical distance, and delivers conclusions downward to those who have not yet achieved equivalent clarity. Conscious participation demands the opposite movement entirely. It requires a deliberate descent back into uncertainty, back into the beautiful mess of genuine human relationship, back into encounters where the outcome is not predetermined, and where being wrong is a real and accepted possibility. The language difference between inflation and conscious participation is specific and worth examining closely. Inflation sounds like this: I can clearly see what you are doing here. I understand what is really happening beneath this. What you actually need is... Conscious participation sounds meaningfully different. I noticed something that might be worth exploring together. I could be completely wrong about this, but I am wondering whether. What is your experience of what just happened between us? The difference is not merely stylistic politeness. It reflects a fundamentally different relationship to one's own perception. Conscious participation holds insight loosely, as a hypothesis offered into a shared space rather than a verdict delivered from an elevated position. But perhaps the most demanding requirement of conscious participation is the one Jung emphasized most strongly. The person at the Sophia stage must become genuinely willing to be seen, not only to see others. They must allow their own uncertainty, their own wounds, their own ongoing incompleteness to remain visible within relationships. Wisdom offered from behind protective glass is not wisdom freely given. It is wisdom weaponized by the ego's remaining fear. Jung believed that psychological integration at its most complete expression produced something genuinely rare and genuinely beautiful, not the mana personality intoxicated by archetypal authority, not the isolated seer retreating from a world too unconscious to bear. Something far more grounded and far more useful than either of those outcomes. He described a configuration we might call the integrated empath, though Jung's own language pointed toward the same essential quality. This is someone who feels everything deeply. The perceptual sensitivity is fully intact, perhaps even heightened, but something structural has been built through years of genuine inner work that changes the relationship to that sensitivity entirely. The integrated empath has developed what Jungian analysts call a psychological container, an inner structure strong enough to hold intense perception and deep feeling without being swept away by either. They can sense the shame beneath someone's anger without becoming destabilized by it. They can perceive the unconscious pattern driving a relationship dynamic without immediately needing to name it, fix it, or use it as evidence supporting a theoretical framework. The quality of presence this person brings into relationships carries a particular texture that people feel immediately even when they cannot articulate why. It is love with genuine boundaries. It is the capacity to witness another person's pain completely, to sit inside the full weight of it without flinching, without rushing toward resolution, without transforming the moment into a diagnostic opportunity. This is the crucial contrast with the inflated mana personality. The integrated Sophia figure is not observing human struggle from a comfortable elevated distance. They are fully present inside the mess of actual life, genuinely affected by what affects the people around them, while remaining grounded enough that their presence becomes a stabilizing gift rather than another variable requiring management. Jung held a vision of psychological development that extended far beyond individual benefit, and it is worth sitting with that vision carefully because it reframes the entire purpose of the Sophia stage journey. He believed that individuals who successfully navigated the deepest levels of individuation became what he described as cultural medicine. Not teachers positioning themselves above students, not gurus collecting followers who validate their elevated status. Something far more quietly powerful than either of those configurations. People whose integrated perception heals simply through the quality of presence they bring into ordinary human encounters. Consider a final composite portrait. Someone who moved to genuine Sophia-level development, experienced the isolation, fell into inflation, and then received something invaluable. Honest feedback from people who loved them enough to say clearly that something had shifted in the wrong direction. That feedback cracked something open rather than simply wounding it. The cracking was the point. What had hardened into a perceptual weapon softened back into a genuine gift through the humbling experience of being genuinely wrong about their own clarity. What emerged on the other side of that cracking was something qualitatively different from anything the earlier stages had produced. Not less perceptive, more perceptive, but wearing that perception differently, lightly rather than heavily, curiously rather than conclusively. This is the quality that people in the presence of genuinely integrated wisdom consistently describe and consistently struggle to articulate precisely. They feel simultaneously seen and completely free. The person across from them clearly perceives things most people miss, and yet that perception arrives without agenda, without the subtle pressure of someone who needs their insight to be confirmed and celebrated. Clarity combined with genuine curiosity is extraordinarily rare. When you encounter it, something in you recognizes it immediately as medicine rather than performance. What Jung mapped across his lifetime of clinical work and personal psychological exploration ultimately points toward a single, irreducible tension that never fully resolves. And understanding that tension is perhaps the most practically useful thing you can take from everything we have explored together today. The same qualities that make Sophia-level perceptual clarity genuinely powerful are the exact qualities that make psychological inflation so seductive and so difficult to self-identify. Accurate perception feels like wisdom. Wisdom feels like authority. Authority feels like it deserves to be heard, followed, and confirmed. That chain of feeling is not entirely wrong, but it requires lifelong conscious management rather than a one-time breakthrough that permanently solves the problem. Jung's ultimate message was not that wisdom elevates you above ordinary human experience. It was precisely the opposite. The deepest wisdom does not isolate. It connects more fully, more honestly, and more humbly than ordinary consciousness manages. Perception without compassion is not wisdom, it is surveillance. Insight without genuine humility is not enlightenment. It is arrogance that has simply acquired a more sophisticated vocabulary for justifying itself. The Sophia stage is not a destination you arrive at and then inhabit permanently without ongoing effort. It is a practice, a daily, sometimes hourly practice of choosing conscious participation over comfortable observation, choosing curiosity over conclusion, and choosing genuine connection over the seductive safety of being the one who sees without being seen. If you want to go deeper into practical Jungian work, including boundary drills and perception training grounded in these exact principles, explore The Alchemist's Path by Surreal Mind at thesurrealmind.com. The resources there are designed for serious inner work rather than surface-level inspiration. If this content reached something real in you, please like, share, and subscribe. There is significantly more depth psychology worth exploring together.